that goes across. Can you all see that? I take your silence for assent, as I can't hear you. And this may, yes. Can you see my little arrow going across?
I can, Steve, and I think I'm the only one who has got my voice on. So,
right.
but I'm trusting that people can see your little arrow.
Lovely, yes, you can
see everybody.
That's lovely. So this piece of wood down there going there, we call that a stay. I mention this because there are 1,500 different words in ringing, 1,500, which is about 3 times as many as is used by the Sun newspaper. I just mentioned that. And of course, many of those words in the Sun newspaper we don't use at all because they're a bit rude. So anyway, that's bell, that's one of the words, you probably knew that one. But this thing here is called a stay. And across here, that's called a slider. And that can go back and forth as the bell goes round. It goes all the way round and it hits the other way and back again. And of course, you can see a wheel. So you recognize what that was. And the wheel, there's no ropes there at the moment, but the ropes would go right round the wheel and then off again. Now, Sarah, you're speaking for everybody. Do you want to ask a question?
Well, it looks incredibly complex to me, Steve, and very different to the few views that I've had of a bell tower, which I have to admit is limited to Lydia Tregose. So I'm trying to absorb this and recognizing that many people in the audience understand this much better than me.
Yeah, well, quite, because some people are ringers, which is a funny thing. Yeah, I mean, the bell itself is made of copper and tin, approximately half and half, a little bit more copper than tin. Of course, that is extremely expensive nowadays. So a bell is very valuable just in terms of scrap metal, so you don't want anybody to pinch them. And the frame there, of course, is made of cast iron. At one time, they were made of oak. And there are some very, very fine oak frames in and around Lydia Tregose in that area, not in Lydia itself. Some of them dating back 4, 5, 6, even 700 years. So there are some amazing frames about. Anyway, so that's what you look at when you're at the top. Now, I'm just going to get rid of this stop screen sharing. There we are. You're back again. I can see you all. You all look a bit thinking, what's he going on about that for? We know all about that because we're bell ringers. Anyway, so why do we do that? Why do we ring them upside down? You probably wondered that. And the reason is 2 reasons. Firstly, because I'm going to do a demonstration here. Demonstration of bell ringing. How about this? Because what we're aiming for in bell ringing is a strict tempo musical art form, which is very like something like country dancing. We get our bells to weave patterns around each other and to weave different patterns. And we enjoy it. We like listening to it. And in fact, most of the public like listening to it as long as they don't live too close. I don't know what lives right next to a bell tower, particularly in a flat, and it's not the same. But the public generally enjoy it. So we go into this strict tempo musical art form. We are trying to get the bell to sound at an exact spot, metronomic. We try and get the sound metronomic. We move these bells around, but they're metronomic, one beat after another. Now, the thing is, when you pull this, get this bell to go around, I'm going to demonstrate now. I'm going to demonstrate. And first of all, here is a bell rope. How about that? This fluffy bit here, which is made of wool, is called the Sally, and the rest of it is made of flax. Some of them nowadays have a lot of pre-stretched polyester in the top part. They used to be made of hemp. They're not made of hemp any longer because you can't get it because of problems like cannabis and stuff. Also, they used to make them out of hemp, but hemp has to be stuck in mud for 6 months before you use it. It's not very practical nowadays. Right, so I'm going to give a demonstration. Here we are. Now, this could be the first time that a stepladder has been used in a Zoom talk. So just remember that. So I'm going to step back here. Whoops. Right. So here we are. My wife Sue will stand up on this stepladder and pretend to be a bell. And I am showing how it works for those people who've never seen it. Right. So I hold it like this. The bell's up there. I put it like that. I let go. It goes up in the air like that. Of course, it goes faster than the real thing. Right up like that. And then I'll put it back down again. Down it comes. Like that. I catch hold of this, goes up a little bit. I pull it again and off. Right? Thank you. Right. So much for the step ladder. But you can see that it's actually quite a tricky thing to do, because this bell, most bells weigh at least a quarter of a ton. Many of them weigh half a ton, 2 tons, 3 tons, even over 4 tons. And so what you're doing is controlling this huge weight of metal from 40, 60 feet below, rather like playing an upside down yo-yo, if you see what I mean. And it's extremely difficult because the bell itself, another demonstration here, the bell itself, right here, I'm being a bell, this is my clapper. It's a bit longer than my neck, okay? So it's like that. It starts off, you saw that when the bells were stood, when they were up like that, they were slightly at an angle, weren't they? Because of the stay put them at an angle. So you start off with your clapper on this side, and you start pulling it off, it comes down like that. Amazingly, the clapper comes away from the bell first. So it comes right the way around like this and catches up the bell about 7/8 of the way round. And then it goes bong. And we ring it like that with the clapper on the trailing edge of the bell, because when it sounds, it goes right the way out over the countryside. We are one of the few places in the world where we ring with the clapper on the trailing edge of the bell and comes off. It's known as a thrown or flying clapper. In other places where they ring like that, in France or Germany, their clappers are on that side. And instead of the clapper catching up the bell catches up the clapper. Right. Did you want to know that? You probably didn't really, but that's what we call a falling clapper. And the point about a falling clapper is the bell actually sounds when it's pointing downwards. So instead of a full sound going out over the countryside, you get a muffled sound coming down through the floor. Okay, so that's why we do it. And also because actually controlling this bell is a fantastic physical experience. I mean, it's actually a real pleasure. Those people who aren't ringers, who've never done it, have a go. It takes quite a while, weeks, to be able to do it, because you're catching this sally, not by looking, but by rhythm. You pull this tail in, down comes all this rope, you catch this sally, you pull it, and of course, you've got to make it, you've got to catch it so that that bell remains absolutely dead upwards. If you pull it too hard, that stay that we're looking at breaks and it goes round and you go up in the air like you see on Christmas cards. You know, you see monks and choir boys. So actually getting that is very, very difficult just to control it. Thereafter, we ring with such accuracy that you have to get your bell to sound exactly midway between 2 other bells that are themselves sounding half a second apart. So you have to ring your bell within an accuracy of at least a 30th of a second. And many ringers ring to an accuracy of a 50th of a second or a 100th of a second. And that's with a bell that when they pull it, it doesn't sound till 2 seconds after they pull, which is the biggest physical gap between the action and the sound of any musical instrument in the world. There you go. How about that? So all you ringers there, you can take a bow at how jolly clever you are that you can do that, because you can all do that. It is an extraordinary thing. Only the canon in the 1812 overture has a longer period between the physical action and the bang. Apparently you have to light it 15 minutes in advance. But apart from that, it is the longest gap. So you've got to be listening offset from the action. Yes. For those of you who aren't ringers, take it up. You will find it's very, very fulfilling. It really is very, very fulfilling. I mean, lots of people write me letters when they've taken up ringing when they're sort of in their 50s and 60s, and they say, I wish I'd started 40 years ago. You're never too old to start. You're never, ever too old. We've been teaching people in their 80s. So start now. Anyway, so much for that. So much for that. So it's a physical challenge. It's a great pleasure, and that's lovely. But just to get back to the history of it, we've been doing this since 1400 and something. We're not quite sure, because the trouble with any of these things is that it was such an everyday thing to most people for hundreds of years that they never wrote what they were doing. Like eating. You know, it's very, very difficult to get any written material. However, we do have some written material. The earliest written material we have in relation to ringing is 1602. 1602, and there's a guy called the Duke of Stettin, Pomerania. That's what he was called. He was also Prince Rugen, Lord of the Belltown lands, or excuse me, all sorts of stuff like that. And he came from what's now Germany, because Germany wasn't invented in 1602. He was a very bad man, sadly. He ruled his dukedom so badly that thousands of his peasants died from destitution. It's awful. But he spent his money on touring the world. He's one of the first tourists. He had his own boat, and he arrived in London in 1602. Of course, there were no cameras then, so he bought his own diary writer to write about everything they'd seen. And this is in German, this. I'm going to quote here, but not in German, so it's not in medieval German. But anyway, so he moored his boat in Limehouse, spelt in the diary Leimhaus, which I think is rather fun. Limehouse, and he recorded this. Are we ready? He said, on arriving in London, we heard a great ringing of bells in almost all churches going on very late in the evening. We are informed that the young people do that for the sake of exercise and amusement, and sometimes they pay considerable sums as a wager who will pull the bell longest and ring it in the most approved fashion. Parishes spend much money in harmoniously sounding bells, that one being preferred which has the best bells. The old Queen, of course it's referring to Elizabeth, she died the following year, you know. The old Queen is said to have been pleased very much by this exercise, considering it a sign of the health of the people. The same thing happened on the following days until 7 or 8 o'clock. And the thing is, when you're talking about 1600, London wasn't so big then, but nonetheless it was the biggest city in the world at the time. It had a huge number of churches. Every single one of those churches had bells in. And people, men, I have to say, not women, men used to go up there entirely at random and ring the bells. And they were all ringing at the same time. And that's the interesting thing. What he was listening to, this diary writer, was not one church ringing, but dozens of church ringing bells all at the same time. And you'd now like to know what this sounds like. And hang on, how do I get back to this? I'm trying to get.
You go back to your screen share, Steve, at the bottom of your screen.
Yes, I know. I haven't got. It's not a screen share I'm trying to do. Oh yeah, here we go. Well, this will do then. Right. This is. Can I get this to work? Yeah, I can. Right. This is a piece of music by William Byrd. William Byrd was a guy who wrote a lot of music around about that time, and he wrote this in 1580, or possibly a few years earlier, and it's supposed to be a record of bells all ringing in London at the same time. And now I can't start it. Oh dear, but I've got it on the other thing. How do I,
Oh, it's down here.
wait a minute. Hang on.
Oh no, that's.
I can't, oh, yes, I can. Don't go away, people.
We're not going anywhere, Steve.
Aha, well, it worked for a moment, didn't it? But not for long. So so much for that. Anyway, you get the idea. You can see that. Hang on, stop it, you lot. I can't. They won't stop, these lot. It's a. Oh, right. Yes. Equally, try this one. This is even earlier. Possibly not. No. Oh well, there you go. I was going to play to you. There we are. I was going to play to you a piece from approximately 80 years earlier. A knell of Johnson is called. A knell at that time meant a collection of bells all ringing at the same time. And you can quite clearly hear that what he's trying to record with these 5 vials is lots of bells ringing at the same time. But the point is, all this ringing was not religious. It was secular. It was completely secular. Vicars keep saying the purpose of bells has always been to call people to church. That is absolute nonsense. For the great bulk of history, that was not the purpose of them at all. And it was actually, so I'm putting a thumb up. Yes, it was not the purpose. Indeed, churches generally, it was only part of it was intended for religious purposes. Only the sanctuary, only the chancel was intended for religious purposes. The rest of the church was essentially a public building, used for public purposes. And the same thing went for bells. They were intended solely for pleasure and rejoicing and all the rest of it. They were completely public. They were up in towers, but they were not 4 towers. And so people used to go in and ring, and complete strangers would, as long as they could ring, could go into any church, go up into the ringing chamber, as we call it. The ringing chamber is a lovely phrase, isn't it? Go up in the ringing chamber and ring the bells. It was as simple as that. Not only could they, but they were expected to. And that went right the way on until the middle of the 19th century. And in fact, because it was a pleasure thing, because it was such fun, the Puritans decided to stop it because they didn't approve of fun. As you know, they cancelled Christmas. By law, Christmas was cancelled by the Puritans in the time of the Commonwealth. So at the same time, they decided it was time to cancel ringing because that was fun. And this is, I've got a quote here from an ordinance for the better observation of the Lord's Day. No person or persons shall hereafter upon the Lord's Day use, exercise, keep, maintain, or be present at any wrestling, shooting, bowling, ringing of bells, or pastime, mask, wake, church ale, dancing, games, sport, or pastime whatsoever. So they banned just about everything that was fun that they could think of, and it included bell ringing. And in fact, at that time, there was no question of bells calling people to church. Services went on for a very, very, very long time, hours and hours and hours. And people went in and out during it. They weren't expected to stay the whole time. And a single bell was rung at the start of the sermon because at that time, people actually liked to go to the sermon. Nowadays, they like to miss that bit. So if you had a sermon about how they said, all leave. But in those days, there was a sermon bell and people went in. That was the only bell that could be rung, was the sermon bell. Right, but so about this rejoicing business. So the aim was you rang bells for rejoicing. The public wanted them rung. They still do, actually. They still do. So rejoicing. So, for example, here's a bit from 1660. If you remember, 1660 was towards the end of the period of the Commonwealth, the Puritan time, when we had no king. Just to explain, the civil wars were, of course, or the civil war, if you like, it was really 2 or 3, depending how you look at it, was the most awful time in the history of England. A greater proportion of the population died during the Civil War than in the First and Second World Wars combined. Many of them died through brutality and rape. And it seems to me amazing that such a shocking, bestial period in the history is actually celebrated by people dressing up and pretending it was some kind of fun game. It wasn't a fun game. When it came towards an end, General Monk descended on London with the great column of soldiers. And to begin with, people weren't sure whether he was going to start it all up again or whether he was going to stop it. And when they found he was going to stop it, they were in fact incredibly pleased. And a chap called John Evelyn wrote this in his diary. Diaries are very good with this sort of thing. General Monk marches to Whitehall and convenes the old Parliament, the Rump Parliament being dissolved, and for joy whereof were many thousands of rumps roasted publicly in the streets at the bonfires this night, with ringing of bells and universal jubilee. And when Charles II was crowned the following year, this is what John Eden wrote. He said, "The London militia lining the ways and the several companies with their banners and loud music ranked in their orders, the fountains running with wine, bells ringing. Thence with joyful acclamations, His Majesty passed to Whitehall, bonfires at night." And I mentioned about bonfires at night because the two things people wanted for celebrations were bells and bonfires. Bells and bonfires have always gone together. We talk about bonfire night and people think it's something to do with burning Guy Fawkes. It's not. The people were celebrating on the 5th of November, but they were celebrating in two ways. They were celebrating with bells and they were celebrating with bonfires. And they carried on doing that right up until the 20th century. Indeed, they had special ways of ringing. They used to ring all the bells at exactly the same moment, and what we call nowadays firing. So they sounded absolutely simultaneously, and they called that shooting old Guy. But the bonfires were every bit as important. It wasn't a separate thing. And you can go back through history, bells and bonfires always went together. What amazes me is where they got the fuel from the bonfires. One moment the king said, "We'll have bonfires." There were bonfires. Obviously, fuel was in considerable shortage, particularly in London. However, but but getting back to ringing without permission, this is quite important because come the middle of the 19th century, particularly, some vicars got upset about it. I don't know if you've got any vicars watching at the moment, so close your ears at this point. But some vicars have always been a bit kind of, bit dirigiste, bit kind of telling everybody what to do. And so there was a thing called the Oxford movement in the 19th century. If you're historians, you know all about that, so I won't bore you with it. But the point is, they were kind of trying to turn the church, instead of being a sort of a public joyful thing that it had been, into something more serious. And so they started having organs, for example. Most organs do not predate the middle of the 19th century at all. They had a lot of locals who would go in there and play their instruments. And they were known as the local band, and they would play their violins and their sackbuts and their serpents and things like that. Obviously, varying degrees of skill were involved, but they were all turfed out. Why Methodism took off, chapels took off to a large extent, because the fun people were driven out of the Church of England. However, at the same time, a lot of these vicars thought that bell ringers should go the same way. They never did, actually. In general, we still have the same kind of social and cultural arrangements that ringers have had for the last 400 or 500 years. And it's been very successful, splendidly. But there were one or two places where it got down to vicars locking all the ringers out, others where the ringers locked themselves in and locked the vicar out. There were fights and all the rest of it. And these have become very public historically. And the church generally, after the Oxford movement, tried to pretend that it was very common. It wasn't common. And there weren't that many of it, many occasions of it, but it went on. So it was just part of the propaganda of the Oxford movement. However, incorporating that propaganda was a question of drink. Now, you probably all know that everybody likes to say that ringers used to go up into their ringing chambers and drink great quantities. You've probably all heard that. It appears in histories quite a lot. It's not true. And the reason why it's two reasons not true. Firstly, it's not true because most ringers were very poor. They simply could not afford to drink to get themselves drunk. They did not have the money to do it. But what did happen was it was common for ringers to be paid in drink. It was quite a good system, really. What generally happened was ringers did not get paid for their normal drinking, or at least generally they didn't. But if they rang for something special, they expected to be tipped, as it were. They expected someone to come along and give them money. So if, for example, there was a military victory somewhere, they would go up and ring the bells, and they would expect the wealthy people of the parish to come along and give them some money for having done it. They weren't paid in advance, they were paid in arrears, or they weren't paid at all. It was quite a good system, but it was a better system if they got paid in drink, because if they were paid in drink, first of all, it was cheaper for the person paying because they got a load of drink in bulk. Secondly, it was a good idea for the recipients because it was a way of being paid that they couldn't share with their family. I mean, it sounds awful, but I mean, that's the way these things are. So they could simply get on and drink it. It was not necessarily all that much drink, but it was a popular way of doing it. And here's I've got a few quotes here. Have you all read Parson Woodford? No? Anyway, he wrote a load of diaries in the 18th century. He was a vicar in Suffolk Way. And he said, one of these things, Western bells rung yesterday and again today on Mrs. Custance being brought to bed in the new house. Mrs. Custance was, of course, the squire's wife. Being brought to bed means she was going to have another baby. She had actually a very large number of those. So there was a lot of ringing went on. And of course they rang and then the squire came and paid them afterwards. Similarly, this is Parson Woodford again, great rejoicings at Western House, bells ringing, guns firing, etc., on account of Mrs. Custance coming downstairs. Imagine she did that too, but anyway. I gave my people on the occasion a bottle of gin to drink this evening in the kitchen. I'm most heartily glad that Mrs. Custance is so much recovered. Dinner today, chicken and oyster sauce, a pig's face, cold loin of veal roasted, etc. He always recorded his food. Lots of diaries in the 18th century. When it comes to paying, there's another one. This is Parson Woodford again. He had a number of churches, and one of them was Babcarry, and he went there on a horse which was called Cream. I mentioned that because you're wondering what this Cream means here, but that was his horse. After breakfast, I went upon Cream to my curacy at Babcarry, where I read prayers and preached. Read prayers in the morning and preached in the afternoon. This is the first Sunday I ever officiated at Babcarry Church, and I like it very well. I was rung into the parish by Mr. John Bower's order, who gave the ringers a pail of cider on purpose to ring me into the parish. They gave me another ring this afternoon after service, which I gave them 2 and 6. Now, at that time, a agricultural worker in his area would have earned about 7 shillings a week. So 2 and 6 for the 5 of them was actually a good bit of money. I mean, that was real money. But you can see a pail of cider. Well, it doesn't sound very nice, does it, having a drink in a bucket? And one of the things was, in those days, lots of ringing bands had their own jug for putting drink in. It was generally called a gotch. A gotch is a very, very big jug. And you had this very, very big jug, and you got, when it was fired, it would have a rhyme on it. Everyone had to have a rhyme. So here are some rhymes. This is the Beccles jug. When I am filled with liquor strong, each man drink once and then ding dong. Drink not too much to cloud your knobs, lest you forget to make your bobs. A bob is a technical thing in ringing. But this is the Hadley jug, the Hadley jug. If you love me, do not lend me. Use me often and keep me cleanly. Fill me full or not at all, if it be strong and not with small. As you know, small beer was low alcoholic content. The Ixworth jug, Ixworth in Essex, they actually used to take this jug once a year round the village to get the villagers to pour their offerings into it. So by the time they got to drink it, it was a mixture of all sorts of things that had been poured into this jug. It sounds disgusting, doesn't it? But it goes, here you may see what I request of honest gentlemen. My belly full of the best, I come but now and then. Yeah. I don't know if anyone here's got a ringer's jug that they use, a gotch. Actually, if you've got one, it's quite a good way of collecting donations, not drink donations, money donations, you know, for charity at Christmas, going around with a gotch. It's very effective. So much for that. But but getting back to people who saw ringing, in those days, it was massively popular. It wasn't just something for a few odd nerds up in towers like it is for us nowadays. In those days, it was a major public thing. It was like football. People really knew about ringing in a way they don't now. They really understood it. Whether they rang or not, they really knew about it. They cared about it. They turned up in large numbers, in thousands to hear good ringing. It was quite extraordinary. There'd be cheering, there'd be betting. They had competitions that went on for hours and hours and hours. I've got one diary report of a competition that started at 7:30 a.m. and went on till 3 a.m. next morning. So it went on for 19 and a half hours of ringing with one team after another. And even then, several thousand people waited till 4 a.m. to hear the judging. That's how it was. It's hard to describe how it was. Of course, there was massive betting went on, and there were lots of fights and all the rest of it. So here's a report from the Halifax and Huddersfield Express of the 10th of August, 1836. So it's a while ago. A ringing match took place on Wednesday at Darton near Barnsley between the ringers of Kirkheaton and Holmfirth for £20 a side. I mention here that these amounts were often wildly exaggerated. It probably wasn't £20 a side. It was just something I used to say. Kirkheaton went into the tower first and rung 2 hours and 46 minutes. They weren't, nowadays, competitions you ring for about 5 minutes, then they rang for 2 3/4 hours, making about 800 faults. The Holmfirth band followed, evidently in good spirits, and stuck to the ropes for 2 hours and 45 minutes, making about 150 errors. Before the umpires declared in favour of Kirkheaton, so positive were the friends of the Northians, can't say, that their leads were the vicars, that they carried them out of the ringing chamber on their backs. The village of Darton was never known to have been so busy before, there being about 3,000 strangers present, and from 40 to 50 different sets of ringers from all parts of Yorkshire, most of which expressed their delight with the ringing of both parties. There you go. This was a little village in the middle of nowhere. 3,000 people went to hear the ringing. It's amazing, isn't it? Yes. Everyone being quiet. Any questions, Sarah? Have I missed something? I glanced over something.
No, not at all. And you've got lots of interest and messages piling up. And I was interested to see from Vicky Rouse, is it, to everyone, that they have a ringing jug at Dinton in Wiltshire, though they don't use it. So maybe they need to start thinking about collections. Yes,
well, think about collections, absolutely. I think everybody should have a ringing jug to take charity collections in. But anyway, yes, right, okay. Well, just gone. One of the curious things about bells is that throughout history, and even today, we have a very pagan approach to bells. We imagine them speaking to us. They actually say, the bells call people to church. The bells call people. Isn't that extraordinary? We give them names, like Great Peter and Big Ben, that we'll talk about in a minute. We give them names. We write things on them, put inscriptions, as though they are speaking to us. So they say things like, little bells can say, I mean to make it understood, though yet I'm little, yet I'm good, for example. Tenors have things that tenor, by the way, our biggest bell we call a tenor. The reason why we call it a tenor, not the bass, is because the word bass came in the English language after we started ringing. So while musicians started calling the deepest note the bass, in ringing we never changed. So we still call the deepest note the tenor. Okay, so just explain that for non-ringers present. But anyway, so and tenors have things like saying, I to church the living call, and to the grave I summon all. And these were cast onto the side of the bell. Nowadays, you can cast more or less anything on the side of the bell, unless it's not rude or too long. You have to get a faculty from the Church of England to do it, but you can cast on. So any of you who aren't ringers, if you want to get a good memorial for someone you loved, a parent or something like that, a bell would cost you as little as £10,000. How about that? And you can record the name of your loved one forever. It'll be ringing there for 1,000 years. And so people always put these inscriptions on, or at least for 500 years, they put inscriptions on. It's not easy. It's not easy. There's a church down in Dorset where the church wardens, this is some hundreds of years ago, ordered an inscription, love your God. And in fact, it actually says, love your dog. And you can see how that happens, because the person who did it, they were illiterate. They were upside down in a mold, writing back to front. It's not easy when you can't even read or write the right way round. So they got it the wrong way around. There have been other cases like that. Winchester Cathedral, I don't know if anyone who's been up to Winchester Cathedral, got a fine ring of bells put in 1938. And so they put the name of the king on the side of the bell, which was fine, except they put in by tailors. Tailors thought they'd get ahead by actually casting the bells in 1937. So historians here will immediately see the point of this. So if you look at the bells now, you'll see they've hacked off Edwardi Octavi and stuck on Georgi Sexti, because obviously they didn't realise that Edward VIII was going to abdicate between the casting of the bells and them being stuck up the tower. It is a problem. But talking about Big Ben, I don't know if you all know about Big Ben. Big Ben, there was an old Houses of Parliament. It burnt down. They were trying to burn tally sticks and it got out of control. Tally sticks were kind of medieval way of recording debt. They'd been around for a long time, and it was a tragedy that they were all destroyed, but they were. But at the same time they destroyed them, they destroyed the old Houses of Parliament. So they built a new Houses of Parliament, and once they were going to build it, they said, we're going to have a big tower stuck up the side, and we'll have a clock on the top of it with a big bell. And they got a chap called Denison, Edmund Becket Denison, his name was, later Sir Edmund Denison, later on Baron Grimthorpe. He didn't know anything at all about clocks or bells, but they said he could design the clock and the bells to go up there. As I say, he didn't know much about it. Nonetheless, he actually did a pretty good job. And 4 of the bells which he designed are still up there. The quarter bells, which are very, very heavy bells, they were all cast by John Warner in Woolwich Dockyard, and they are very fine bells. Listen to them sometime. Next time you've got the news on, listen to those quarter bells. They are beautiful. But when it came to the biggest bell, hadn't got a name then, biggest bell, they found it was too big to cast in the Woolwich Dockyard. So instead of that, they decided to cast it in Stockton-on-Tees, and then to bring it down by rail. The bell was 16 tons, which was half as big again as the previous largest bell in the country, which was Great Peter. in York Minster. So they cast this bell, 16 tons, and when they cast it, they realised it was then too big to come down the railway to London. So they widened the line to West Hartlepool so that it could come down by sea. They took it out to West Hartlepool and they got a boat, a billy schooner called Wave, which was especially strengthened to take a 14-ton bell. Now, if you were keeping pace with this, you'll see that Big Ben actually weighed 16 tons. And so when they put it in the boat, it cracked the boat. So, here's a quote. This is from the Essex Standard of the 1st of October, 1856. Fall of the Westminster Great Bell. They weren't calling it anything then, right? In craning this great work from the foundry at Hartlepool into the billy schooner Wave of Wisbeach, the great machinery gave way and the ponderous mass fell into the hold, doing so much injury to the hull of the vessel that it was necessary to dock her immediately. The captain was in the hold, but happily escaped unhurt, and it is hoped that the bell is uninjured. There we go. So went back into dock. They spent a week or two repairing it, put the bell in, off it went. Now, in those days, there was no ship's radio. It's before the days of ship's radio. So there was a storm at sea. Presumably, the Wave, the Wave, went into one of the many small ports that there were all the way up and down the coast of England. We don't know. All that we do know is that everybody thought that the boat and the bell were lost at sea, and that was the last they'd seen or heard of it. But nonetheless, it ended up in London in the fullness of time. The tower had not yet been built, so they put it on a scaffold and they kept ringing it. And they did it with a hammer. The hammer weighed 1,300 weight. 2/3 of a ton the hammer weighed. That's extraordinary. That's the hammer. And they kept belting with this thing. They belted it 24/7 for a very, very long time. And then what happened was it broke. The bell broke. That was the end of the bell. And there was a massive firestorm of publicity saying this is a terrible, terrible thing that this great bell has been broken. And so they had another tendering process. And on this occasion, it went to George Mears of the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. The Whitechapel Bell Foundry closed recently, having been in operation since the early Middle Ages. Many people believe that it is the oldest manufacturing company in the world, with the exception of the Royal Mint. Quite remarkable. But anyway, so they got the order. Here's a little bit of a poem that went the rounds at the time, which went, because you remember John Warner's did the old one. This one is done by Mears and Sainbank of the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. Mr. Warner is sent to the corner for making a bad Big Ben. Mr. Mears, so it appears, will make us another. But when? The point that was, if you're into the politics of the time, was it was taking so long to get around to completing the Houses of Parliament. It was a public scandal. But in 1858, they actually completed the new Big Ben. They carried on belting it with a 1,300 weight hammer, and they stuck it up the tower, whereupon, surprise, surprise, it cracked. And this is from the Oxford Journal of 1859. The day had been a rainy and windy one, and Big Ben and his companions were thoroughly wetted. As each blow was struck, Mr. Hart noticed a line of minute air bubbles spring into momentary existence on the side of the bell, and a closer examination revealed the spirit, the secret, revealed the secret. And so, of course, Big Ben was cracked. It still is cracked. If you listen to it before the 6 o'clock news, you can hear quite clearly it's cracked. It's the most famous cracked bell in the world, probably the most famous bell in the world, actually. It is a fine bell, but it is actually hit with a hammer that's half the weight of the old one. So hopefully it won't crack again. They might have thought of recasting it, except for the fact that they couldn't get it out. They still can't. there's no way out for those bells without demolishing the whole lot. So we keep on with it, how it did. But you're going to ask, how did it get its name? You heard it called Big Ben there. And actually, you can read a lot of nonsense about this. One of the things is, George Mears thought it was called Victoria. And if you get the London Illustrated News of the time, there's a fine drawing of it being pulled across Westminster Bridge by 16 black horses with tassels. It's the most amazing thing. And it says the bell Victoria being pulled across Westminster Bridge. He thought it was called Victoria. The Parliament thought it was called St. Stephen, would you believe? And not only St. Stephen, but here's a bit from the Chelmsford Chronicle. On Wednesday morning, the great bell was raised to an upright position. When all the arrangements are completed, the bell will be christened not by the name of Big Ben or Victoria, as stated, but by the more appropriate name of St. Stephen. And the Reading Mercury said, the great bell at Westminster, St. Stephen, as it is now named, late Big Ben, attained its extreme height on Thursday. And amazingly enough, they even had a naming ceremony. And this is how the Lancaster Gazette described it. They said, Mr. Quam, director of the Queen's household, directed that a royal salute of 21 sounds should be given. Between each stroke of the hammer, the men gave 3 hearty cheers, and Mr. Quam designated the bell St. Stephen. Extraordinary. So you are going to ask, or you would do if you weren't all muted, why is it called Big Ben? And that's a very good question. And one of the things is, part of the pagan way that we look at bells is that we believe that a bell can be recast, that we can get a bell and we can melt it down and make a new bell with some of that metal and some other metal, and it's still the same bell. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. It's a completely pagan idea. But that's what they did here. They melted it down. They came up with this new bell. So, but the first one was never actually called anything. It was never called Big Ben. But it seems that what happened is that at that time, lots and lots of people, if they had something that was big, they called it a Big Ben. Like some people talk about something being a Big Bertha nowadays. And it seems most like, people are called Big Ben too. I mean, Benjamin Corn, the prize fighter, was called Big Ben. So if you're a big man, you might be called Big Ben, whether or not your name was Ben. And it seems likely that while the people up in Stockton-on-Tees and West Hartlepool were trying to lumber around this massive thing, they were referring it to that Big Ben of a bell. And the press took it up. And the press simply then started calling it Big Ben. I found what I think is the first quote. This is from the London Standard of the 22nd of October, 1856. And he said, all bells, we believe, are christened before they begin to toll. On this occasion, it is proposed to call our King of Bells Big Ben. I assume they made it up, like the press do all the time. But the public took it on, not least because they thought it was named after Benjamin Corn, the prize fighter. And when it came to the Houses of Parliament, eventually in 1859 on the new bell, they couldn't resist the public pressure to call it Big Ben. And that's how it is. Am I overrunning here, Sarah?
Steve, a little bit, but it's so fascinating. But maybe you'd like to fast forward us to World War II. But
okay.
Thank you. Any juicy details on the way.
I was going to, because it's on the blurb, isn't it? So I'm going to mention World War II. So I will mention World War II. And the interesting thing about World War II is the one thing everybody knows about World War II is that ringing was banned except to give notice of invasion. Everybody knows that. It appears in masses and masses of histories all over. And so I thought I will find out if that's true. And so I believe that Sue and I, we went to the Public Records Office and we went through hundreds and hundreds of files and thousands of pieces of paper to find out the truth. And it was clear that no one had ever done it before, presumably because no one was that much interested. I mean, the trouble with history is when people repeat something enough, it becomes fact. And once it's fact, no one bothers to research it. They just keep on repeating it. And so it goes on and on. So just to explain, the government order that said ringing had to stop was ostensibly issued on the 13th of June, 1940. 13th June 1940. Just to put that in context, Italy had joined the war on the side of Germany at the beginning of the week. France fell at the end of the week. Okay, so it was a dire time. And they put out this public order, and it said that no ringing could take place except when you saw more than 5 parachutists landing. Okay, it did not say if there was an invasion. It was only relating to potential invasion by air. If it was less than 6 people, it was probably one of our planes bailing out, so you didn't do anything. If it was more than 5 people, it must be them. I don't know if there are any war historians present, but of course, the war attack on Norway at the beginning of the war in 1939 was very effective. It hadn't happened before then. So there was a serious concern, but that's all it was supposed to do, was supposed to those people. Now, and it didn't happen on the 13th of June at all. What happened on the 13th of June was that the Home Office had been told to tell the Archbishop of Canterbury in confidence so that he knew. And in fact, the Lambeth conference was taking place, and it was the last day. And so he just told everybody at the end of the conference, he just added in, oh, by the way, chaps, ringing's banned. And as from immediately is what he said, it wasn't at all, it wasn't going to be brought out until the following week. But the Home Office then had to come up with some weasel words, which didn't actually say it was wrong, but didn't actually say it was right, which is why history says it was stopped then. It wasn't, but by the by. But from the very outset, people didn't realise that it was only air attack it was supposed to be warning against, not all attack. Nonetheless, people started being very careful from the beginning. And one of the things was the BBC, older people here, no one looks old enough for this, but you may remember that years ago, there were no continuity announcers on the radio. If a programme ran short, they put on a 78 record, which had a blip or something. One of it was the Coldstream Guards playing Lily Bolero. Remember that? The other side of the 78, so 78, the other side of 78 was Bow Bells ringing some call changes. Does anybody remember it? Put your hand up if you remember it. No? Oh, well, there you go. It's a long time ago. But, it was half a minute. If it was a bigger gap, they let the needle go round again, and it played it again and again and again. Well, obviously they cancelled that immediately. For the rest of the way, there's nothing but the Coldstream Guards. But of course, they were worried about other things too. And this splendid memo came from John Watts, director of Variety. One of his roles was banning songs. He'd already banned Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition unless sung by a man, would you believe? But so he says here, ban songs. Will you please note that recordings and live performances of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture in its original scoring, i.e. with the bells, are banned for security reasons. The restriction also applies to any work in which the realistic representation of a peal of church bells takes place, as distinct from the use of tubular bells as an integral part of an orchestral texture. There you go. But the point is, despite all this banning, bells did get rung from time to time. Sometimes they rung by mistake, sometimes rung for a joke. There were people who rang bells for a living. I mean, they were talking about older people present during the muffin sellers used to go around clanging a handbell to say they're in the street. No, you don't. Well, it's the people I'm looking at, I remember that. Anyway, but and other people, knife grinders. Remember knife grinders? They used to have a thing, they would put their front wheel up on their bicycle and, no? Anyway, and they used to have a bell. So, of course, they were losing a lot of money. It was like COVID lockdown all over again. And sometimes bells just rung by mistake. For example, in the Blitz, remember we saw those bells that we're looking at earlier on in whites, they were upside down, and lots of bells were left upside down the whole time. If the church was bombed and it caught fire, the stays, that bit of wood, burnt through before the frame down. So that in the midst of the Blitz, you could hear the ghostly sound of church bells ringing, often night after night, as these bells rang down with nobody there. Pretty spooky, eh? And of course, some people rang them for a joke, even in Lydia Trudeau's, which of course was a hotbed of criminality in the war, as you probably know. There were, probably still is, but I mean, there were 3 people were fined for riding their bicycle without a rear light. 1 person was fined for riding a bicycle without a front or rear light. That cost her £1. The other people were 5 bob. 1 man was even fined for selling his eggs at 3p over the going rate because he hadn't taken them to the packing station in Swindon. You could charge more if you'd taken them to the packing station. Very strange times. But anyway, there were some American soldiers went in and rang at Lydia. And if they hadn't been American soldiers, they would actually have been put in prison. When anybody else rang a bell, they were put in prison for at least 3 months. But these guys weren't put in prison. They were just forced to march to church next Sunday, which I suppose was a kind of penance, but not very much. But yeah, but this is the thing. So there were these things going on. There were bits of bells ringing. Normally, if a bell rang, everybody came out of their houses. I've got stacks and stacks of instances where this happened. People came out of their houses, went to where the bell was, stood around for 2 hours discussing it, and then went back home again. It was a strange business. But there was an occasion on the 7th of September 1940. This is something that appears in no newspapers. No newspaper at all was allowed to publish this. The only place it appeared was in the Ringer's publication, The Ringing World, would you believe? Because The Ringing World was the only publication not to have a D notice put on it by the government, because the government never imagined that they could actually reveal military secrets in a ringing magazine, which is a wonderful thing. But on the 7th of September 1940, if you remember, the Battle of Britain had been going on for some time at that time. The whole point of the Battle of Britain was to destroy the UK Air Force so that an invasion could take place, a seaborne invasion could take place. Whilst the Air Force existed, a seaborne invasion was impossible, mainly because it was going to be conducted by a great mass of barges without motors, without engines, that had been taken off the canals of Belgium, France, and Holland. And they were going to be towed across at the most half a mile an hour, even if they were strong enough. In fact, they probably weren't. Many of them, they tested them out, they put tanks in them, and the tanks went through the bottom. It was a shambles, But it could not possibly have been any use at all if there was still air support in the UK. Right, but on the 7th, so they had a signal ready, which was become more prepared, and that signal was Cromwell. What they hadn't got was a signal for invasion imminent, because they hadn't thought of it. It's slightly odd. So on the 7th of September, a plane got lost, a German plane got lost, ended up over the East End of London and dropped bombs. It got these bombs, which intended to drop, it seems, on an airbase, and dropped on London instead. The UK thought that was the start of the Blitz. It wasn't. If that wasn't what it was about, but that's what they thought. And so at 8:07 that night, the War Office issued Cromwell. And the extraordinary thing was that it was a Saturday. Cromwell was issued to all military bases in the country, but the commanding officers, because it was a Saturday, had all got the night off. And so a junior member in each of these bases received this signal Cromwell, and they thought it meant that the invasion had started. And so they gave orders for the bells to be rung throughout the country, and throughout the country, bells were rung. It was a remarkable time. As I say, you can't find it in any of the newspapers. You can find it in the government records, but not in the newspapers. They sent up lots of flimsy training planes with bombs. Bridges were blown up. Soldiers were killed by landmines being put out. It was a most remarkable time. The Home Guard generally turned up at mastering points. Only 6 weeks earlier, they stopped being the National Defence Volunteers, of course. So they were now the Home Guard. They turned up. They were not armed. They came with pitchforks, scythes, knives, ready to fight. I mean, the bravery of these people is absolutely incredible. I mean, they turned up expecting to fight because everybody thought there was an invasion coming on the 7th of September. Of course, there was no invasion. There probably could never have been an invasion anyway. But they all went home again. Well, of course, irrespective of whether anybody thought this was a good idea, the signal, they realized there was now a real problem, because the one thing the military didn't want was the Home Guard turning out, because they were just in the way. Equally, they also realized immediately that if one church rang the bells and they were heard by another church and they rang the bells, if you weren't careful, every night, no one would get any sleep. And one of the problems in the war was you had to feed a nation of civilians. You had to have those civilians creating armaments. You had to have the Home Guard, who of course got fewer rations than the soldiers and vastly less sleep than the soldiers. And the whole thing would have been a disaster. And instructions were immediately sent out. You must not do any of this ringing. But the public weren't told that at all. The public were led to believe that it would just go on like it was. And of course, there was no question of an air attack anyway. So they were ringing their bells for no point, because it was not an invasion by air. Extraordinary. Don't you think? I think it's extraordinary anyway. But this is the thing, when it comes to the signal itself, why was it ever started? And I've been through hundreds of papers on this, and everybody who was asked for advice at the outset said, this signal cannot possibly work, it's absurd. The army said it, the civil servants said it, anybody who was involved said it. And at the end of the time, it nonetheless happened. And it happened because Churchill himself said, we are going to do it, even though everybody said it couldn't work. And I won't bore you with the quote here, but the reason he said it is quite clear from diaries of his secretaries at the time. The reason he said it was because he knew that public support for an overseas war never lasts. The one thing he knew about was the lessons of history. And the lesson of history is that there is never support for an overseas war for long, no matter what. And of course, that's been true ever since. So the only way he could actually get the English public to support the war was to pretend that an invasion was a possibility. In fact, immediately after, well, still in September, 28th September, Hitler actually issued a notice to all his people saying, the invasion of England is called off. We are heading east to Russia. We knew of that because of Bletchley Park. So we knew at the time that there was no possibility whatsoever of an invasion after the end of September 1940. But nonetheless, the idea of the signal carried on because everybody believed that there was a possibility of invasion, and that's why they continued their support. Clever. I don't disapprove of it, but it was absolutely nothing to do. And in fact, it finally stopped in Easter 1943. And at that time, this is one of the interesting things because, well, two things. Easter 1943, they issue an order saying it was stopped. In fact, the order had no legal significance whatsoever. It would have required an act of parliament. They decided on the Monday of Holy Week so they couldn't get one. So they actually issued an order which had no legal force whatsoever, but nonetheless, they hoped no one would spot it, and actually nobody did. So they thought it was all right, and they started ringing again for Easter 1943. But at that time, there's this most intriguing exchange in Parliament. A chap called Sir Thomas More said, "May I ask the Prime Minister what arrangements have been made to replace the ringing of church bells as a warning of invasion?" Churchill said, "We have come to the conclusion that this particular method of warning was redundant and not in itself well adapted to present conditions of the war." So this guy Moore says, "Will my right on friend say what alternative arrangements have been made? Will he consider the use of sirens?" Churchill said, "I said that we came to the conclusion that this particular method was redundant, therefore replacement does not arise." Now, you can read all that in his preparatory notes for receiving that question. But he then said something which was not in the notes, which he made up on the spot. And he said, "For myself, I cannot help feeling that anything like a serious invasion would be bound to leak out." Which I think was the closest he ever came to admitting that the whole thing was a charade. And actually, it was very funny. Everybody laughed, apparently. Yes, that's it. I finished. I could talk a lot more about the war, but you're not interested. Thank you.
That was the most amazing story about the war. I was just talking to my 93-year-old mother this morning, who told me quite categorically that sounding the bells was letting all of them know that it was going to be the invasion. So, I mean, that message absolutely stuck with people, didn't it? But it's so interesting to hear everything that went on behind that sort of created that feeling within the country, or that what was perceived as knowledge within the country. But Steve, you've given us the most remarkable talk, so much to take in, so many interesting points, from the secular nature of the bells to the Whitechapel Foundry to the World War II, and I think we can see in all our churches we can relate that social history to the development in our own churches, and that's been absolutely fascinating. We have recorded your talk. So if you want others to share it with your friends later, it will be up on the Friends of Lydiard Park website, probably within a week. So it just leaves me to say, Steve, thank you so much. We've had a lot of thanks coming in the little chat room that we've got here. Someone has just said that is also what my 98-year-old mother, Kathy, has said this, what my 90-year-old mother says. And she says it was wonderful to hear church bells ringing again after the war. So definitely a shared memory of that generation. But once again, it's lovely to have this huge audience with us. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you especially, Steve, for what has been an absolutely terrific talk.
No, thank you. No, thank you. It's good to meet you all. It's a shame we couldn't meet all together, wasn't it? That would have been fun.
To have everybody's faces here has been lovely. But thank you, Steve. And I hope one day you can come to Lydiard and we can do an event with you in person. That would be marvellous.
Good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.